Begin. For those of you just joining us, we are going through all of the mitzvot in the Torah, hopefully, through the prism of the Sefer HaChinuch. We happen to be in the midst of the Ten Commandments now, or they're not really Ten Commandments, as I've mentioned before. According to Sefer HaChinuch, there's actually 14 distinct mitzvot within the Aseret HaDibrot. We're now on to the mitzvah that has to do with Shabbos. But the truth is, at least according to the counting of the Sefer HaChinuch, there's two mitzvot inside the Aseret HaDibrot, inside the Ten Commandments, that relate to Shabbat. Obviously, throughout the Torah, there are many other mitzvot. We've actually seen previously, outside of the world of the Aseret HaDibrot, we saw the mitzvah of the Tchum Shabbat, of the area that you shouldn't go beyond on Shabbat. So the two mitzvot that he's going to speak about as related to Hilchot Shabbat have to do with, this week we're going to talk about Kiddush. He says that that's a mitzvah in Shabbat, is making Kiddush. And next week he's going to talk about Malachot, about prohibited activities. For him, there are two distinct mitzvot that appear in the same statement dealing with Shabbat. Right, well, he's going to say Shamor v'Zachor. Zachor is this week. It's Zichira. How do you remember the Shabbat? You remember it with Kiddush. And Shamor is how do you guard the Shabbat? You avoid engaged in the Malachot. So he takes those two as concepts. So, okay.
So you're saying the second is going to be next time?
Yeah, next week we're going to talk about Malachot. The prohibited activities. This week, the positive mitzvah of Zichira, of remembering the Shabbat. And that actually, I believe, is the first source. If you have the one page has I copied directly from the Sefer HaChinuch, the Hebrew and English, and we can just even start with reading how he does that. What is the mitzvah, Lamed Aleph, number 31, the 31st mitzvah? Yeah, they're all up here, actually. And I just realized, did Mark come in and start? Yeah, sure, no problem. Okay. Mitzvah 31. Okay. The mitzvah is, that Lamed Aleph is not low, okay? That would do the exact opposite of everything we want to accomplish today. So it begins with the mitzvah, Lidaber dvarim b'yom Shabbat b'knisato v'chem b'yitziato, to speak words on the Shabbat day as it arrives, and again as it leaves. What is it referring to as it leaves? Havdalah. Havdalah, he includes within the mitzvah of keeping Shabbat with words, in which there is a remembrance of the day's greatness and exalted level, and it being set apart from the days before and after it has a laudable time, as it is stated, and this is directly from the Torah, remember the Shabbat day to keep it holy. So remember the Zachor, so it's Zechira. Remember it by recalling its holiness and its greatness. In their explanations, our sages told us that we are commanded to say these words over a cup of wine, for thus the interpretation came down to us in our tradition, remember it over wine. So we learn a couple of things already in the first paragraph. The first thing, of course, is we learn that it's a mitzvah to actually say something, right? You can't simply think it in your heart. You actually have to say, I remember this Shabbat day. This is very similar to what the Sefer HaChinuch writes for us, if you remember, in mitzvah number 16. He says that it's important to articulate, right? It's important to engage in actual actions and sort of bring forth thoughts into the world of reality. And the second thing that we learn from this mitzvah, which is going to be Kiddush, when we recite Kiddush on Friday night, the second thing is what? Is that it has to do with wine. And so what I want to actually spend, strangely enough, perhaps it's related to Purim, I want to spend most of our time today is talking about what is the significance of wine in relationship to the mitzvah of reciting Kiddush. So we're gonna come to that question. What does it mean that men say Kiddush and women do candles? That is the tradition, right? That's the standard custom. The Noda B'Yehuda asks a very interesting question, and we're going to sort of use this question as a prism to try to unlock a number of secrets in this mitzvah. So the Noda B'Yehuda raises this question that actually is against the normative behavior that I imagine most of us are familiar with, which is the man comes home from shul and the man recites Kiddush for the whole family. What does he ask? He says, if you go according to the Sefer Chinuch, the Sefer Chinuch writes, how would you view the mitzvah of saying it over wine at the table? At what level? A rabbinic or a deraita level? Right? He says, the sages taught us this. So it's a rabbinic level. So the mitzvah of actually remembering Shabbat, however, is a deraita level. It's on the level of Torah. The Torah itself says, remember the Shabbat and keep it holy. Yes. Oh, you're hitting all the great points. We're going to come back to Yetziat Mitzrayim and the difference, right? There's two themes that we have. One is to remember Breshit, and one is to creation, and one is Yetziat Mitzrayim. Remind me if I forget that, because that's a very important point that we're going to make. So the Noda B'Yehuda's question, though, is as follows. He says, a man goes to shul. In shul, he recites Kiddush, right? In the davening, in Mariv, he recites Kiddush. He has fulfilled the deraita level of reciting Kiddush. He now comes home to his house. He hasn't yet said it over wine, so he has a rabbinic commandment to say Kiddush again over wine. However, if there is a woman in the house, right, and she didn't go to shul, when it comes to halachot that have to do with Shabbat, men and women are equally obligated, right? Women are usually exempt on mitzvot that have to do with time, right? Shezman Gram, if it's a time-limited positive commandment. But with Shabbat, we say, since God says it all at once, right, in one moment, women and men are equally obligated on Shabbat mitzvot. So a woman has a deraita level, right? She hasn't said Kiddush yet. She has an obligation to say Kiddush, and she has a derabanan level. She has to say it on wine as well. So who at this point in time has the higher obligation? The woman does, because the woman who didn't go to shul, or a man who didn't go to shul, whoever didn't go to shul and hasn't been in Mariv already, has both the Torah level obligation to say Kiddush, as well as the rabbinic. And the man only has the rabbinic. So the Noda B'Yehuda says, if that's true, the man cannot motzi, the man cannot fulfill the obligation of the woman, but rather the woman has to fulfill the obligation of the man. Because the way halacha works is whoever has the highest obligation is the one who can fulfill the obligation on behalf of others, but not vice versa. That's why in regular traditional Orthodox synagogues, only men are leading and davening from the Amud, because you look around, who has the highest obligation? So, who has a Torah obligation to pray every day? Okay, everyone raises their hand, men and women. Who has an additional obligation of praying 3 times a day in certain times? Man. So the man has a rabbinic and a Torah level obligation. The woman only has a Torah level. So at this point in time, the man has the higher obligation. So he steps forward. That's why also, if a man has a yahrzeit, he would step forward. Okay, we go whoever has the highest obligation can be motzei everyone else. So the Noda B'Yehuda asks this very sort of radical question. It says, according to the Sefer Chinuch, who says you have a rabbinic obligation of wine, the woman is the one who should be reciting Kiddush on behalf of the man. The Noda B'Yehuda struggles with this. He says that seems to be the logic, but he says that's not the custom anywhere, and we shouldn't follow the logic I just said. We should follow the custom as it is. But it's a very unsatisfying, if you're interested in sort of intellectual honesty, it's a very unsatisfying response. So the question I want to look at is, how can we respond to the Noda B'Yehuda? Because let's assume the normative practice is correct. So if the normative practice is correct, how can we answer what the Noda B'Yehuda says? By the way, I'm not trying to argue that women shouldn't say Kiddush, should say Kiddush. I'm not doing any type of poskening. I'm just in this world of learning. You should know the Shulchan Aruch, and one of the sources I gave you, points out that there are times when women should recite Kiddush. If you look on the back page, you'll see the very first source at the top, from the Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, Nashim chayavot b'kiddush, afal pi shehu mitzvah taseisha zman grama. Women are obligated in kiddush, even though it's a mitzvah that is related to time. Mishum de'itkash Zachor lishmor, because there is a connection between Zachor and Shamor. Those two words were said at the same time, and therefore they're all Hani Nashe Hoel, and therefore they also apply to women with regards to the Shabbat. Just as women are obligated in Shmira, so too are they obligated in Zechira. So just as they are obligated in the malachot that we'll speak about next week, so too are they obligated with regards to Kiddush and Zechira. Umotziot et anashim. And they can be motze, they can fulfill the obligation for men as well by reciting Kiddush for them. Hoyel v'chayavot mina Torah kmotam, because they have the exact same Torah obligation as men have. So that's the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah. Yes, so well, already the Mishnah Berurah says everyone agrees that that's really the established, that's the halachic categories we're dealing with. Men and women are equally obligated in Kiddush, and the Shulchan Aruch says they can be motzi. However, the Mishnah Berurah says that they are motziot eta anashim, that they can, fulfill the obligation for men. V'chen hiskimu hataz, Magen Avram v'Agra. All these individuals agree. Mikol makom, right? You knew it had to be coming, right? The Mishnah Berurah says mikol makom. Nevertheless, yesh lahachmir lechatchila shelo totzi isha anashim. But we are lechatchila, if there's no reason necessarily, men should nevertheless still be motzi women, not vice versa. He adds this one caveat, she'enam mivnei beitah, that are not members of their household, meaning if it's just a family gathering, the Mishnah Berurah seems to be suggesting there's no problem that a woman could be motzi the man with regards to Kiddush. They have the exact same obligation, but perhaps it's more of an issue of either tzniut or something else, that a woman shouldn't be motzi everyone else if there's a larger gathering. Anyway, as I said, my point is not to focus on the actual practicalities of who says Kiddush or not, but to learn what's going on here. How could we, in a sense, justify the normative practice based upon the challenge that the Sefer the Noda B'Yehuda raises? So there's a couple of ways of answering it. First of all, the Chatam Sofer says it is a real problem, and that's why he recommended to his followers, when you go to shul, to the men, have a negative kavana. Meaning, when you say Kiddush in shul, don't have the kavana that you are going to fulfill the obligation of Kiddush. So if you don't have the obligation that you're going to fulfill Kiddush, when you come home, you have the exact same obligation as your wife, men and women. Right. So that's the Chatam Sofer, is his suggestion. Another possibility is to say, wait a second, maybe this mitzvah, maybe people disagree with the Sefer Chinuch. Maybe the mitzvah of saying it over wine is not a derabanan, but maybe it's a deraita. Maybe you actually have to have wine as a deraita. And there's a machloket that Rav Soloveitchik brings that perhaps sheds light on this possibility. He says there's an argument between Hillel and Shammai in the order that we say Kiddush. Right? How do we say Kiddush Friday night now? We say Yom HaShishi Vayichul HaShamayim. Okay, we say that. Then we say Borei Pri Hagafen. Then we actually say the Kiddush, right? We say the bracha of the Kiddush. That's how we do it today. I assume everyone follows that practice, okay? That's Hillel. Shammai says something different. Shammai says you first say Kiddush, Yom HaShishi Vayichul HaShamayim, then the actual bracha of Kiddush, right? All that stuff, remembering Breshit. You finish Kiddush, and then you say Borei Pri Hagafen, and then you drink immediately. In other words, our practice is to have the Borei Pri Hagafen before Kiddush, or in the middle, right? We have an introduction, then Borei Pri Hagafen, then Kiddush. Whereas Shammai says, no, you should say it only at the very end, and then drink. Why do they hold their different opinions? So there could be an argument about what is the nature of the wine we're drinking at Kiddush. One possibility is that it has to do with chashivut. The reason why wine is not really connected to Kiddush, but anytime you want to make a ritual more significant, you add wine, right? It gives it greater significance. So for example, benching. You don't have to have wine when you bench, but if you put wine out when you bench, it adds chashivut to the importance to the whole proceedings. Sheva brachot. Technically speaking, if you didn't have wine, I'm not talking about under the chuppah, but sitting around the table afterwards, Sheva brachot, you say the 6 brachot, and then you bring wine out to give significance to the other ones. If you don't make the bracha on wine, it's okay. You've done the 6 brachot, but you've done what needs to be done nevertheless. So that seems to be Shammai's opinion, is that the wine is adding chashivut. So you say Kiddush, now I want to add chashivut, so in the same way we do at benching, or Sheva brachot. We now add a glass of wine. So we add a glass of wine, and in order to have the wine, you have to make the bracha. That seems to be Shammai's opinion. He's opposed to Hillel's opinion because if you made the wine, the blessing of the wine earlier, think about it this way for just a moment. If you made the bracha over wine at the beginning of benching, you then bench, and then you drink the wine without a bracha, that seems very odd. The benching is a hefsek, is an interruption to your bracha. You can't make a bracha and then not drink from it. So he would say, Hillel, what you're doing, you're making the bracha of wine, and then you're saying kiddush, and then you're drinking. Kiddush is a hefsek. You've interrupted a bracha before the act to fulfill the bracha. So what's Hillel's response to him? No, that's only if the wine is separate from kiddush. But if the wine is an integral part of kiddush, there's no hefsek at all. I'm making the bracha, but it's part and parcel of what kiddush is all about. So what Rav Soloveitchik says, maybe what we can learn from this machloket is that they're also arguing about D'Rabbanan and D'Oraita. That the D'Rabbanan is the concept of chashivut, right? You don't really need it, but it adds significance. So the rabbi says add it. The D'Oraita is no, kiddush with wine is an essential part of the mitzvah. So therefore it's a D'Oraita. So since we follow Hillel, perhaps what we're saying is, unlike the Sefer Chinuch, when the man comes home, he still has a D'Oraita obligation, because even though he said Kiddush in shul, now that he's home, he still has obligation to say Kiddush over wine. Okay, that's one possible answer to the question. Yes?
What's the connection with saying the bracha over wine and drinking? Because in shul,
Yeah.
you hear it, and maybe some people drink, I don't know who drinks.
Well, it started as...
Most men don't drink.
Yeah, well, it started as a custom in the diaspora because it used to be that many people, travelers, would come through town and they would not have a place to stay, or maybe they would get a place to stay, but they didn't necessarily have a meal. And so, or more often than not, the shul actually had attached to it like an inn of sorts. So, but some of their meal was eaten in the shul. So they would make the kiddush for whoever didn't necessarily have a meal to go to. So that way everyone in the community was yotzei, the hearing kiddush. And then those who weren't going home to a meal necessarily, but maybe were going to eat in the shul, they would have the wine right there and then. Today that's not really the case, but we've kept it as a tradition. And so what usually happens now is you have kids, young kids, right? You make the kiddush. They don't make it to do so much here in Israel, but in Chutz La'aretz they do it all the time. They still make kiddush over wine, and then they ask all the kids to come up and drink, so that it's not a total wasted bracha. But we don't usually have the same reason for saying it in the first place. Okay, so one answer to the question of the Noda B'Yehuda is no. There's still a d'oraita obligation, so that's one thing. The other possibility is you didn't fulfill your full obligation when you were in shul, because it's different than what you think. And that comes back to what you said. The Minchas Chinuch, who asked the same question as the Noda B'Yehuda, right? The Minchas Chinuch, if you look on the second page, that's the source to the side. And if you look down, not in the first paragraph, but in the second paragraph, if you look at the third line, Shekatav de Tfilat Shabbat Yotzei Yedei Kiddush, right? When you're at the Shabbat Tfilah, you have fulfilled the obligation reciting Kiddush. Ki al hayayin hu rak midivrei sofrim, because drinking wine is only from the rabbinic position. The ayin shamu, and you see there, and he then is referencing the question we've already asked. Mipalpel inyan im nashim motziot anashim. They asked the question, maybe women should fulfill the obligation for men, because they have still a d'oraita obligation, and the men have already fulfilled the thing. His answer then is actually very interesting. His answer is, go to the first paragraph. Kan, the nusach hakidush, umuskar sham is yetziat mitzrayim. The nusach that we have the mitzvah of Shabbat, that the Sefer Chinuch brings in Shmot, is Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's why we're remembering Shabbat. What do people say when they're in shul Friday night? By the way, not Shabbat day. But what do we say in shul Friday night? We say the Bereshit version. Vayichulu hashamayim va'aretz kol tzvaam v'echa. We don't talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim. So the Minchas Chinuch says the essence of the mitzvah of Kiddush, remembering Shabbat with words is to remember Yetziat Mitzrayim. So no Rabbi Yehuda, it's not a question at all. And later on, he goes down in the bottom. He says, I don't know why everyone gets so upset. Everyone's making this whole big thing about the men and women. He says it's not relevant. You're in shul Friday night. If you say Kiddush, all you've said is God is the creator of the world. That's great. That's a wonderful thing to say. But you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah of Kiddush because you haven't said Yetziat Mitzrayim. The real Kiddush on Friday night only takes place at home. With wine or without wine, that's not the question. Whether or not you say Yetziat Mitzrayim or not. So when you sit at the table, both the man and the woman have the equal obligations. They both have the Torah obligations of saying Yetziat Mitzrayim. So that's his answer to the question of the Noda B'Yehuda.
You were saying that there are two different versions.
Right, we have two different versions of Kiddush. Like when we talk about Kiddush...
Shabbat you say one thing, and Shabbat during the day you say another thing.
Yeah, and we have two themes. We always have the two themes, right, of Breshit. Even on Friday night, we have the introduction of Breshit, but we remind ourselves also that God took us out of Egypt. And so that for the Minchas Chinuch, he says, that's the real D'oraita mitzvah, is to talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, more so than Briat Olam, creation of the world. So he says that's the Torah obligation. That's what you say when you get home. So we have no problem with the Noda B'Yehuda. But I want to use the Minchas Chinuch's insight of the focusing on Yetziat Mitzrayim and connect it to wine. Because maybe it's not just a halachic technicality, but maybe there's also something about the experience of wine itself that relates to the feeling of Yetziat Mitzrayim. Meaning maybe they have to be together. Think about Pesach coming up, right? What's the sign of freedom? We lay back and we drink 4 cups of wine, meaning it's a sign of royalty almost. Freedom and to be able to do that. And I would say more than that. There's an experience actually in the drinking of wine that sort of releases a certain amount of inhibitions, and there's also a freedom in that. Almost as if we could take what the Minchas Chinuch says about the halachic technicality and say, no, we can actually learn something out. That the drinking of wine, and that's what I really want to focus on, is that what's the importance of drinking of wine? That the wine itself is an experience, an expression of freedom, and therefore that's why it has to be connected to the Kiddush itself. There's an interesting historical footnote to all this. Is wine, because what would be the challenge to what I just said? That the experience of drinking wine is also part of freedom. What's the challenge?
Not to drink too much.
Well, not to drink too much. And what else? Do all of you make Kiddush over wine? Does anyone here make Kiddush over grape juice?
Grape juice.
Yeah, right. I also make Kiddush over grape
Yeah.
juice.
Sometimes my son-in-law makes it, with grape juice, and
Right.
sometimes he uses a stronger.
Right. There was a big question about whether or not you can make Kiddush over grape juice. And it came about really strongly in the 1920s in America. What was taking place in the 1920s in America? Prohibition. So in the 1920s in America, there was prohibition. You're not allowed to drink or buy alcohol. An exception was made by the U.S. government for ritual drinking, and I think every Jewish household that argued that they need sacramental wine was allowed to get, if I'm not mistaken, I printed out the article, 10 gallons of wine a year. Now the thing is, where did you get that? The government wanted to have some control. So where did they get their 10 gallons of wine? They would get it from their local rabbi. If you were a rabbi, you were given permission to give out 10 gallons of wine to each of your congregants.
Each family.
To each family. Now,
People we came from.
You're absolutely right in a couple of ways. One is some people actually decided to start going to synagogue and becoming members and everything like that because there was a way of getting 10 gallons of wine. But something else also happened that wasn't is that the bootleggers saw a loophole here. And they started making the arrangements with some rabbis, and they started sort of cooking the numbers, saying, you don't have a congregation of 100 people, you have a congregation of 500 people. And then, of course, the rabbis would get the permission for an additional 400, and they would then make deals with the bootleggers. The bootleggers were able to, they did all the government paperwork and the bureaucracy, and they helped out these remember the 1920s, these rabbis were impoverished. They would, the bootleggers would help them a little bit with this. And you can imagine what happened next, and that is they were caught, and there was newspapers, all over the country that's connected. The scandals we read about today, the same thing. Rabbi caught, cooking the numbers, this, that, and it was a real chilul Hashem, right? Because it was about how using religiosity to get around the laws of the state. The reform movement came out with a responsa, came out with a decision. You must make kiddush on grape juice. Forget, we're not interested in wine anymore. We're going to remove the possibility for any type of chilul Hashem. You can only have grape juice. The Orthodox, he said, absolutely not. You must remain. This is our tradition. It's always been our tradition. Absolutely, we must stay this. We shouldn't do illegal stuff. By the way, some looked aside and said maybe it's okay. It made more people more firm. But by and large, people said, yes, it's a terrible thing, but we don't change halakha as a result of that. And there was a very sort of vociferous argument about whether or not you can make kiddush on grape juice halachically. There was a conservative rabbi, Louis Ginsburg, who had an Orthodox background, and he wrote a very long tshuva. And he argued, not like the reform movement that says only use grape juice, but he wrote a tshuva that says it's permissible to use grape juice. And you can see some of the sources he used on the back page again. Let's see if I... before I even get to his explanations, he put forth a number of different opinions. He says that it's only the Magen Avraham who says, traditionally, you absolutely are obligated with wine. Everyone else seems to be that you're permitted. You look at source number, I don't number them, I apologize. It's the third source down from the top, the Shulchan Aruch, Makdishim al yayin mevushal, right? You make kiddush on cooked wine. Va'al yayin sheyesh bo dvash. You can also make kiddush on wine that has honey in it. V'yesh omrim she'ein makdishim alehem. There are some who say no, you can't make kiddush on yayin mevushal, boiled wine. And then there's a whole machloket of what is boiled wine, because boiled wine is getting close to grape juice in that our wines used to be very strong. Have a very high alcohol content, and when you boiled it, you got rid of it, and it's kind of like the pasteurization process that eventually enabled there to be grape juice. So Louis Ginsburg, by the way, he argued, he says, one of the arguments against going to grape juice is, well, pasteurization is a new process that we didn't know about, so we have to keep whatever we used to do before. Well, that doesn't make sense, he argued. Well, we didn't used to have gas. Right, we didn't used to have oil, so you're telling me that you have to now, light our lights only with, gas, not electricity. He says, no, you can develop. He says, if the cause, and he quotes the sources that says, if the cause of a tradition, of a custom, is accidental, then you're not bound by continuing that tradition. It's only if it's purposeful. So he says the grape juice was not purposeful. So anyway, he's quotes the Shulchan Aruch that you are allowed to do this. The Ramah says the minhag, the kadesh alav, afilu yeshlo ayin acher, even if you have other wine, but it's simply not good. Kamo mivushal or sheyesh bo dvash, meaning ideally you should use wine, but if you don't, it's permissible here. The next Shulchan Aruch says yayin mega'ato makdishim alav. A wine that's more like a grape juice is permissible. How do we know this? The Gemara actually says, "V'sochet adam eshkol shel anavim v'omer alav kiddush hayom." You have a group of wine, a bunch of wine. You could squeeze it into your cups, and then immediately say kiddush, right? Quoting a Gemara. So there's proof that it wasn't fermented. So grape juice seems to be okay. That's Louis Ginsburg's argument. Most of the Orthodox rabbis came out vehemently against it and said, absolutely not. You'll see the source right below is from Rav Uziel, who's here in Israel, the chief rabbi in Israel. He says, yes, I'm familiar of all those different ideas. If you go to the big paragraph in his source of Rav Uziel's, L'inyan kiddush, af al gav de halacha psuchahi, even though the halacha says, Sochet Adam Eshkol Anavim Makdishim Alav, Mikadesh Alav, even though you could squeeze a cluster of grapes into a cup and make Kiddush right away, Mikol Makom, by the way, one of the things he doesn't say, but I would argue, you could do away with that particular argument, because what does it say in the Gemara? You can make Kiddush Hayom. Now, you could read that as Kiddush on Shabbat, or you can read it as Kiddush Dafka on Shabbat day, which is not necessarily the same level of the Kiddush on Friday night. But that aside, he doesn't focus on that. Mikol Makom, even though that's what it says, the halacha is that you could make it on grape juice. Mitzvah, it's a mitzvah to choose Livor Yayin Tov, the Kadesh Alav. It's a mitzvah to actually make the bracha on wine. The Rambam posel the Kadesh al Yayin Lavan. The Rambam says you can't even make Kiddush on white wine. Magen Avram Katav, and the Magen Avram writes, mitzvah b'yayin yashan. You should really have that old, strong wine that had lots of time to ferment. Mistabra the asis anavim shehu lavan eno yayin tov, and the fermentation process with white wine, apparently, this is what he's suggesting, it's not as strong as when it's with red wine. It's not as alcoholic enough. Hilchach mitzvah l'kadesh al yayin mamash. Therefore, it's a mitzvah to make kiddush on wine that's good. V'lo al asis anavim, and not simply on grape juice. She'eno yayin tov, and that is not really wine at all. So, as you see, he's representative of a traditional Orthodox position. Most were opposed to having kiddush on grape juice at all, that you only could do it on wine. And perhaps the reason, he focused on fermentation a lot, perhaps the reason is because of that wine has that physical influence on you that you do get liberated a little bit. And if we go back to the Minchas Chinuch, that it's connected to the concept of freedom, so maybe this has an actual impact, and therefore that's why we need to have it. There's another idea we could perhaps argue as well, about, he says Yayin Yashan, and that seems to be a focus a lot, that the problem with not wine, is that it's a quick process, meaning wine takes time. It's fermentation. The Midrash says that, what was the fruit that Adam and Chava ate from in the Garden of Eden? So there's a lot of different opinions. Some say it was wheat. Some say, of course, it was an actual fruit. Some say it was the etrog. Some say it was grapes. And whenever you eat the alternative, you're doing a tikkun, right, a repair on the original sin. So on Sukkot, when you have your etrog, you're doing a repair, right? When you have that simcha in God's, you're repairing sort of the lack of simcha that took place in the Garden of Eden. So with regards to wine or the grapes, what some say is, the Midrash says, the sin was not that they ate from the tree. The sin was that they didn't wait until Shabbat to eat from the tree. The tree was going to become permissible to them in just a little bit, but they couldn't wait. They didn't have the patience. So when we, on Shabbat, drink wine, right, and we drink wine that symbolizes patience because we waited for the fermentation process. We didn't simply squeeze the grapes and right away make Kiddush. We did a process that you have to think ahead. Right? All about Shabbat is preparing ahead, thinking about Shabbat on Sunday, on Monday, on Tuesday. So to have wine, it means you have to think ahead. So that you have the patience, you have the ability to delay gratification. That's the repair of the sin in the Garden of Eden, and you repair it by drinking wine on Shabbat. So that also could be the significance of wine at this point in time. The epilogue to the whole story that I told you about the prohibition and bootleggers and everything like this, which is interesting, is if you look at the next couple of sources, after the prohibition ended, most Orthodox rabbis changed their minds and said it's totally fine to have grape juice. The reason why we drink grape juice today, if you have it on Kiddush, is because there isn't really a prohibition. It doesn't seem to be, at least. If you look at the source below, what we just read of Rav Uziel, this is Rav Avadia Yosef. Someone asked him, Mitza Navim v'yayin she'ovrim ta'alich shel pistor, right? That's pasteurization. What about wine that's gone through the pasteurization process, or grape juice? Ha'im efshar lekadesh alehem b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov? Can we make Kiddush on Shabbat and Yom Tov, ulevarech alehem borei pri hagafen, and make the blessing afterwards? And his answered below, is no problem. On the grapes as well, grape juice. Mivarchim alehem betchila borei pri hagefen. You make the blessing before and borei pri hagefen. Ulasof bracha me'ein shalosh, and you make the bracha me'ein shalosh, right? Meaning the bracha for wine afterwards on the grape juice. Shehi al hagefen v'al pri hagefen, and it's from the gefen. Matishim alehem b'shabbatot v'yamin tovim. He has no problems whatsoever, and what some sociologists of halacha suggest is that when the government says you're not allowed to have wine, when you're not allowed to fulfill a certain mitzvah, so then the rabbis have to become very defensive because we can't allow an outside source to determine what is halacha. But once there's no outside influence, so then we have the freedom to really, right? We have different answers during time. God forbid, I don't want to say this is the shmad, but when there's a government edict, you may have a different answer than when there is no government edict. So in the 50s and 60s, when there's no government edict, most of the Orthodox rabbi says that it's okay to have grape juice, unless you hold by the opinion that I mentioned, that you actually have to have this sort of physical experience with wine. Maybe that would be the one possible exception to what I just said. So that's the second answer to the Noda B'Yehuda's question. I'm jumping around, but hopefully it's still making sense. Noda B'Yehuda, remember, he raises the question, maybe it should be the woman who makes kiddush. Well, if it's the man didn't say Yetziat Mitzrayim in shul, he still has the exact same obligation when he comes home. So that's the second answer, yes.
Wouldn't, if you have to have wine, wouldn't you be saying Borei Pri Hayayin? Would you say, thank you Hashem
For wine, meaning if you're saying it's specifically wine.
Right.
You could, although
The
the
custom from the beginning, why would they make it?
Because it's-
You don't say it.
because it's really from where what we try to do in all things is, what we try to do in each thing is to recognize the source of the food, because that's how we thank God, right? So we don't usually talk about the end product. We talk about the source. The end product is man's creation.
Is the end product.
So that's the one exception. And that's why, by the way, when it comes to motzi lechem min haaretz, when we make that bracha, you don't have to make any other brachot. Why? So the rabbis speak about that being sort of an ideal form of a bracha, because bread is unlike other things. Borei pri hagefen is unlike borei pri adama, because it involves human partnership with God. God creates the wheat, we harvest it, we do it together, and so therefore it's that partnership between man and God, which is what Shabbat is also all about, so it covers everything. But you're right, you could have said, there could have been a unique bracha, if the purpose was really only to have wine, we could have said something, the rabbis could have said specifically, but I think historically, Borei Pri Hagafen was wine. The Chiddush is that Borei Pri Hagafen could actually be grape juice. That's the real Chiddush, because you couldn't use, grape juice is not as easy to make as you think it is. It's true, the example in the Gemara of just squeezing the grapes is pretty easy. Yes, but if you don't eat, how many people, do this, right? If you want to store that, pretty soon it's going to become wine, right? So how do you store grape liquid and keep it as grape juice is a hard process that we only made it possible with pasteurization. Prior to then, all our grapes became wine, unless you drink it right away, or vinegar, right? Unless you did it immediately. Okay. But I'm glad you mentioned the idea of bread, because that raises an interesting question. We've said up until now that you have to have wine, and the question is the wine d'oraita? If it's d'oraita, then it doesn't matter, everyone's equally obligated. Or maybe it's d'Rabbanan, but the real mitzvah is not wine, but it's Yetziat Mitzrayim. But maybe you don't have to have wine at all. That's the third opinion of Sefer Chinuch. If you go back to the front page, he actually speaks about the concept that we mentioned about that there's a physical impact of wine, and that's part of the reason why you have to read it. If you read the second paragraph, at the root of this mitzvah lies the purpose that we should be stirred as a result of this deed to remember the greatness of the day and affirm in our heart our enduring faith in the creation of the world out of non-existence. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them. He rested on the seventh day. Therefore, were we commanded to perform this deed with wine, for a man's nature is greatly stirred by it as it sustains and gives joy. Okay? Now here's the interesting thing. He's not saying the exact same thing that I just mentioned about how the alcohol in wine has an impact on us to create simcha. But he is saying that the defining characteristic of what we have to do when we say Kiddush is to have simcha in our lives. And for most people, wine would create that degree of simcha. Can you make Kiddush on something else if you don't get simcha from wine? Not just grape juice.
Make it on chocolate.
Right? So he doesn't say chocolate, but he does give us an option. The last paragraph. In view of this root purpose, our sages of blessed memory said in the Talmud that if a man loves bread more than wine, he should say the blessing of Kiddush over the loaves of bread. Meaning, because that's what gives him simcha. That's what we're really after.
Diabetes.
What?
If he has diabetes, he's not allowed to have.
The grape, yeah. So he could, if he can't do it and he can't have it, and the thing that will really give him joy is over bread, then his nature will be more stirred by what he desires. We want the person to have what he desires. You might say, by the way, then, according to this opinion, that chocolate, right, would be the source. I don't believe there's any opinion I've ever read that says chocolate, but bread could be the case.
Find it, let me know.
I will let you know, okay. So he then goes on to say, and at the day's departure, they did not say this with regards to Havdalah, but the obligation on Havdalah is only wine. Although, if you don't have wine, you are allowed to say it over other liquids. Chashivut, remember the concept of chashivut? Other liquids that have importance. Beer, usually, but could be other things as well. The way it was explained to me is anything that you would say to a person, let's go do this. So if you would say to a person, let's get a cup of coffee, since it's both an activity as well as a drink, that means that drink is chashivut, has importance, you can make Havdalah over it. You don't say to a person, let's go meet over a cup of water, right? So you can't do it over water. But you might say, let's go meet over drinks at a cocktail, something like that, or a coffee, or, tea is an interesting question. Do you say, let's go have tea? I guess, yeah, I guess you do. In England, you certainly do. Okay. Yes, I didn't mention it, but he does mention it. If you look on the front page, the Sefer Chinuch, the footnote number 2 tells you what a log is, right? Because the second paragraph in the Sefer Chinuch says, in substance, this mitzvah means that 1/4 of a log of full strength is poured into a cup. So what is a log? It's 11.7 liquid ounces in one view. So 1/4 of that would be 2.9 liquid ounces, or 86.4 cubic centimeters by the first view. By the way, there's a very nice story told about the Chafetz Chaim that he held by the larger opinion. You see, there's 2 possible explanations of how much wine you're supposed to have. He held by the larger opinion. And when he passed, when his, I think one of his students went into his house, and they noticed that he changed his cup. He had a Kiddush cup that was small, and then he went to a Kiddush cup that was larger. And they noticed the Kiddush cup that was small, that he had made Kiddush on for many, many years, decades, was actually less than the amount that he held, that he wrote about, is the proper amount for a Kiddush. And they asked him about that, and he says, well, this Kiddush cup, the smaller one, was a gift from my wife. I don't know if his wife received it from her father or something like that, but that was a gift from my wife to me to make Kiddush on. And so even though I didn't hold that it had the right amount, it was too small, but it still met the minimum opinion, I made Kiddush over it because it was a gift from my wife, and that also has significance. That also has chashivut, right? One day maybe I'll share with you an interesting halachic question about chashivut in that regard. And he says when his wife passed away, however, he then moved up to what he felt was actually his a Kiddush cup consistent with his actual statements. Okay. Now, raises an interesting question. You can have bread. So maybe wine is not as important as we think it is. Or maybe the fact that bread is a substitution, it sheds light on what is the real significance of wine, right? Meaning there's now somehow parallel, wine and bread. So what do we learn from bread, right? What does bread teach us with regards to making Kiddush? So for that, I want to go to the last set of sources, and talk to you about another, I think, interesting debate. And we'll see if it's a debate that exists here. Okay, I'm looking myself. Where am I?
The question to decide, if having the meal, if you don't have a meal, have you fulfilled Shabbos? Because there's nowhere in there that says you have to have kiddush, you have to have wine, but where does it say you have to eat a meal?
So it's not in this.
Having the bread
Yeah.
substitute signifies you also should be eating.
A meal. Okay, that's what we're going to get to, exactly. The question is Kiddush connected to the meal, or is it separate from the meal? Okay? So the machloket I wanted to ask you is as follows. When you say Kiddush, Friday night, how many of you stand?
For the Suda?
Yeah, Kiddush, when you say Kiddush.
Stand and sit.
You stand and sit. Where do you stand? You stand at the beginning until when? Before Borei Pri Geffen or before?
No, after break.
Okay. Anyone sit the whole time?
My father
Yeah, you're,
is from German background.
okay. So that's the machloket. There's some who say you stand. I mean, it's a very Jewish thing, right? You know that famous joke, what's the tradition? You know, there's some say we stand for Shema, some say we sit for Shema, and the new rabbi comes to town, and the rabbi says, well, what's the tradition? And this one says, it has to be sitting, it has to be standing, and they start arguing, and the rabbi says, no, that's the tradition. You're arguing. That I remember. That's the tradition. Okay, so what's the tradition? What's the source of these traditions? So the source of standing comes from the concept of giving testimony, of giving edut. And in tradition, in halacha, when you give testimony, you had to stand. So if you're giving testimony that God created the world and God liberated us, so you have to stand. By the way, another source of testimony is a custom that the Chazon Ish actually says is a mistake, but this may be more for the men, or women if you go to Friday night services as well. Have you ever missed inside the tefillah vayachulu? So if someone misses vayachulu inside the tefillah, what do they usually do? Afterwards, they usually try to grab someone and say, will you say vayachulu with me? Why do they need to grab someone? Because vayachulu is also about testimony, and you give testimony with two people. So you find the other person. The Chazon Ish says, that's very nice, but testimony that is about dinei nefashot, like capital cases, you need two witnesses. But for testimony that's dealing with like a monetary issue alone, you only need one witness. So therefore, you don't need to go find that other person in order to give testimony. You can just stand and be done by yourself. But that's an aside. So the one opinion is it's all about edut. We have to stand to give testimony. But what about those people who sit, or what about those people who stand and then sit? So if you look. Let's see. Look at the last set of halachic sources, starting with the Shulchan Aruch. You see that it's third paragraph up from the bottom. Mikadesh al kos malei yayin shelo yeh pagum. You make kiddush on a full cup of wine that doesn't have any imperfections in it. By the way, it raises an interesting question. What's the machloket today about this particular halacha, about a cup that doesn't have a pagum in it, any sort of flaw in it? Are you allowed to make kiddush on a cup that's chad pa'ami, right? That's only used. Maybe that's not considered michubad enough, and therefore you can't make kiddush over it. That's why, by the way, I don't know if you ever see this in shuls. Sometimes if there's not a real kiddush cup and they only have plastic cups, what do sometimes people do? They take a second cup and they put it under there. The argument is somehow making a kiddush over two cups makes it more mechubad, right, than if you just have a kiddush over one cup. I don't necessarily think that makes much sense, but there's another interesting argument about this. There's a machloket actually between Rav Schachter and Rav Moshe Feinstein about chad pa'ami in general. Because if it's a real cup, what does that then mean? Well, you keep it, and what else do you need to do with it? You need to tovel it, right? If it's not plastic, I'm not talking about, but let's say you have like aluminum, something aluminum. So if it's permanent, you have to tovel it. If it's not permanent, you don't. So Rav Moshe says, okay, it's not permanent, but once you say that it's not permanent, then you can't make kiddush over it because it has a definition of being pagum. If it is permanent, you can make kiddush over it, but then it needs to be toveled. Rav Shachter felt that aluminum needed to be toveled. So, for example, he wouldn't drink from a Coke. He doesn't drink, from what I heard, from a Coke can because he felt the Coke can is an actual kli. It's a real kli, and therefore it needs to be toveled. So he would pour Coke into a cup, then he would drink it because it would otherwise need toveling. Anyway, that's another machloket about making kiddush. But if you ever see that, if you ever see people putting paper cups and they put 2 or 3, that's part of the logic there. Anyway, the Shulchan Aruch, they're not permanent, right? But apparently maybe it's feeling is that it's more mechubad. You don't have the problem because it's paper of having to tovel or not tovel. But that's... So it goes on and says, what do you say at the end of that, after the memhe on that line? Vayomer vayechulu, you say vayechulu me'umad, standing. V'achar kach omer borei pir gefen v'achar kach kiddush. You're standing. Why are you standing? Because you're standing to give edut. What does the Ramah say? V'yechol la'amod b'sha'at kiddush. It's okay to stand at the moment of saying kiddush. V'yoter tov leishev, but it's better to actually sit. V'noagim leishev af b'sha'ah shomer v'yechulu, and there are some who have the custom, his custom, is to sit even when you say v'yechulu, not just wait until we get to the borei pir gefen or the paragraph of the kiddush itself. He says, no, sit the whole time. Rak shematchilim omdim, but at the very beginning you should stand for a few words. Katzat likvod Hashem. Why is it likvoding Hashem for standing for a few words? It's not to do with giving edut. He says as follows: Ki matchilim. How do we begin? Yom hashishi vayechulu hashamayim. What is the Roshei Tevot of Yom Hashvi'i? Hashem. Yud Hey Vav Hey. Okay? So he says you should stand for Yom HaShishi Vayechulu HaShamayim, because the Roshei Tevot, the first letter of each word, spells out God's name. You should stand then, and then sit entirely afterwards. That's the Ramah's opinion of how to recite Kiddush. I'm sorry? Right. So why is it better to sit? What's going on there? So what is the reasoning behind that? So if you look at the next source, the Mishnah Brura is going to help us out here. He says, Vayomer vayechulu me'umad. He says, with regards to standing, when you say vayechulu, standing, shehu edut al briat shamayim va'aretz. It's giving testimony about the creation of the world. The edut ba'inan me'umad. And you need to stand when you give testimony. I'm going to now just go. The next source, right below that, meaning the Mishnah Brura Mem Vav, he's now explaining the Ramah. The Ramah says it's better to sit. So what does the Mishnah Brura explain here? Vayeter tov leishev, it's better to sit. What is the case we're dealing with? Mikrei tefei kiddush b'makom sudat. We're talking about when you make kiddush at a place of a meal, meaning not in shul, but at home. Sheyoshev b'makom sudato be'et kiddush v'chen hiskim be'or hagra, that you should sit because kiddush is part of the meal. Okay? And what do you do when you eat? It's not about giving testimony. It's about sitting down at a meal. And the Gra goes on and says, and what is taking place? He says, the kiddush is what's kvi'at hasuda. It's koveya the suda. This is how we know we're about to eat a meal. And the Gra says, and what you should do when you sit down for a meal, it's not just a physical act. There's a spiritual act going place as well. You should look at everyone, because when you're koveya suda, you're establishing that we're all eating together. The experience is a unifying factor. And therefore, if you're standing, when a person stands, it says you haven't yet committed, right? You haven't committed to this table. Everyone is mifuzar, uses the language mifuzar, which we have from the Megillah, right? Everyone is distant and distracted and going their own ways. They're not connected. They're not a full unit. Once you all sit around the table, now you're a full unit. And that's what's required to say Kiddush, that you have to say Kiddush together as a totally unified force. That's the Gra. He explains why we sit, and I think he also gives an explanation, perhaps based upon this, to our question of the Noda B'Yehuda. The Rav Aaron Soloveitchik, not Rav Soloveitchik that many know from Yeshiva University, his brother, gave a source for why are you allowed to do kiruv. Kiruv, you can make certain exceptions to do outreach to Jews who are not observant. So one of them, he says, is you're allowed to say Kiddush, even if you've already said Kiddush. You could say it again for someone who hasn't heard Kiddush. Why are you allowed to do that? So he quotes the Gemara in Brachot that says, every Jew is responsible for every other Jew. And he says, so long as there's any Jew out there who has not fulfilled their obligation, you are allowed to help them fulfill their obligation, even if it means that you have to repeat something that you've already done. And he says specifically with Kiddush. With regards to Kiddush, even if you've already made the bracha, you're allowed to make the bracha again. It's not a wasted bracha, because that person has not yet fulfilled their obligation. So he says that's the source for outreach, that we're all responsible for one another. And therefore, he says, if you have to say Kiddush 100 times even, you say it 100 times, because someone hasn't fulfilled all their obligations. So if you take that idea and apply it back to the note of Yehuda, you could see the husband comes home, he may have said something in shul, but if people at the table have not all heard Kiddush, there's no problem with him saying the Kiddush again. Again, I'm not saying that the woman shouldn't, based upon what we saw otherwise, but there's no prohibition. Beforehand, the note of Yehuda suggested that the woman is obligated and the man is obligated not to say it. Here you see that it's a question of unity. The man can say it again and again and again as many times as he wants. Yes?
I want to know if every Jew is responsible for, the other Jew, etc. So I haven't cleaned my house. So is the other Jew going to come?
They might. Listen, if you tell them, put out a sign that says, I have chametz in my house and I'm not going to get rid of it. A yeshiva bacher should be concerned enough to come up and clean out your house. Let me just end with one last very quick idea. We said that how to explain the importance of wine. One way to say is that it's d'Rabbanan, and then that creates the problems we mentioned of that the Noda B'Yehuda raises. The other, we spoke about the possibility of the real mitzvah is Yetziat Mitzrayim, that it's not about the wine at all. We said maybe the wine is deraita. Okay, there's a few different possibilities. Rav Soloveitchik, now this time the Rav Yosef Dov Ber Soloveitchik, he teaches something connected to brachot and Shabbat that maybe we could apply here, that basically perhaps could argue that the mitzvah of sitting down for Kiddush is not about the wine at all, okay? Not Yetziat Mitzrayim, but something else. It's all about the bracha. He says that he says that Shabbat gives you the koach for whatever we do all during the week. Now, there's a couple of ways of understanding that. One way of understanding that is there's a midrash that says if the whole Jewish people would keep just 2 Shabbatot in a row, Mashiach would come. There's another midrash that says if Am Yisrael would keep just 1 Shabbat, Mashiach would come. So why is there a machloket? Certainly 1 is better than 2. It's easier to get to. So perhaps the machloket is the real mitzvah is 1 Shabbat. If all of Am Yisrael kept 1 Shabbat, but you have to keep it at a very high level. The way Shabbat's supposed to work is you keep Shabbat, and that Shabbat has an impact on how you keep Monday and Tuesday, right? Because if you really experience Shabbat how it's supposed to be experienced, you're rejuvenated, you sort of readjusted your sights of what's important for you the coming week. And so your Monday is different, your Tuesday is different, your Thursday, your Friday, and then your next Shabbat is different. So perhaps there's not a machloket in these 2 different midrashim. It's 1 Shabbat, but in order to get the highest level of 1 Shabbat, you have to also keep the Shabbat before to get you in. So that's one way of understanding that it sort of, the koach of Shabbat affects all week. But the way I think Rav Soloveitchik understood it is as follows, is that the Gemara in Brachot says that if you don't make a bracha before you eat something, it's like you're stealing it, because it's God's. The bracha is what gives you permission to now take part in something else. So the truth is, how do we have permission to do anything in this world? How do we have permission to create or build on Monday or Tuesday? It's not our world. Well, what gives us permission is the parallel to a bracha is kiddush, is Shabbat. If you recognize that the whole world is God's, that's the purpose of a bracha. That's also the purpose of kiddush. If you recognize that the whole world is God's, so then you're allowed to do something on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday because you've recognized that it's really all from God. So Rav Soloveitchik would say, it's not the wine that's important, It's that you made the bracha over wine in the first place. Meaning you've said Kiddush, and now you're making a bracha, that you made a bracha that says this is all from God, and it's part of Kiddush, and the words of Kiddush, which speak about God creating the world, that's what gives us permission going forward. I mean, those are a few different possibilities of what it means to say Kiddush on Friday night. Have a good day.
Thank you so much.